is Russia cracking down on mis and disinformation in the Ukraine conflict? And is their control of information trying to cover for some battlefield failures? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's August 3rd, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, let's take a look at the control map, right? The combat map is no updates today, but what I thought was really interesting is when we look at where Russia is launching its counterattack efforts, you could see they're really concentrated. One, of course, outside of Staromayorsk, Velka Novosilka, which shows that this is probably one of the most contested areas right now, with Ukrainian forces probably trying to drive the Russians out of Orozane, since again, they control Staromayorsk, the area to the north, and the area to the east of the town. So Russian forces here under a lot of pressure and probably trying to counterattack in an effort to maintain control. Of course, you've got limited Russian combat actions south of Donetsk City, as well as considerable Russian counterattacks outside of Bakhmut and Klitschivka, where, again, reportedly, you can see here, right, where this shows Ukrainian forces controlling a large portion of Kurdyumivka, as well as along this rail line in Andriivka. Of course, the only other place we're seeing Russian offensive action is sometimes in the north, but today, again, not really any action reported. So Russia concentrating its counterattacking forces in areas that are primarily meant to blunt Ukrainian efforts. But again, there hasn't been any liberation or significant change in territory in the last 24 hours. As always, guys, if you want to see the uncensored combat footage from the front lines, I consolidate all that on combatvetnews.com. And honestly, it's the best way to support the channel. Any one of these membership tiers will get you access to the uncensored combat footage, breakdowns, as well as an exclusive room on the Discord. You guys know YouTube, not a huge fan of the content. Patreon gave me the boot off. Really, it seems like the big tech does not want Ukraine coverage on their platforms. So I have my own platform, and if you want to support me on it, it means the world to me. Now, let's talk a little bit about things getting even more sort of complicated, right? Especially as far as Russia cracking down on many of the alternative sources of information. For example, pro-Russian mill bloggers who up until this point have been very just sort of unified in a lot of their stances, are actually starting to fight among themselves, right? One group of pro-war mill bloggers remain critical of the Russian conduct of the war and are being dunked on, basically, and being accused of being imbeciles and provocative publications by Kremlin-aligned pro-Russian mill bloggers. And this, of course, is because the mill bloggers are posting images showing the aftermath of Ukrainian strikes near Sevastopol and Chonar, the Chonar Bridge, while, of course, they're firing allegations at one another of stealing crowdsourced collection funds and all sorts of standard internet hate. But what is interesting to me is that there seems to be a movement where some mill bloggers, especially following the arrest of Igor Girkin, sort of the grandfather of Russian mill bloggers, some are very much aligning with Kremlin talking points, avoiding speaking about negative things that happen to Russian forces. In turn, some remain as independent voices, acknowledging the flaws and failings of the Russian military and the Russian war effort. And ultimately, I think this is reflective of a Kremlin who increasingly views the bad news stories about the war as being a tremendous problem, one that needs to very deeply be cracked down upon. There's a theory that, again, the highest echelons of Russian military command are directing these mill bloggers to remain silent about these problems that can be pinned on Russian command. And this may, again, be partially driven by actual battlefield failures, but more likely it's also driven by the rebellion by Wagner, where the Wagner forces had so much public support because so many critics were allowed to voice their real concerns about the Russian Ministry of Defense's conduct in the war. What's even more interesting is that even tech companies are not immune from it. Russia has actually levied considerable fines against Apple for not deleting content it claims was, quote, inaccurate about the Ukraine conflict. Right now, a Russian court has fined Apple 4,000 rubles for its failure to remove content deemed to contain false information about Russia's military action in Ukraine. They are guilty of failing to delete podcasts and apps spreading false information about the conflict. It also, of course, fined Wikipedia for leaving up content it didn't like about the war in Ukraine. But it's worth pointing these things out because you can see that a lot of autocratic regimes really love using whatever the West's modern boogeyman is to justify their actions. For example, in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, you saw authoritarian countries engage in wars against terrorists, and terrorists were almost always just political dissidents. Similarly, now you see the war against misinformation and disinformation is being used by these autocratic regimes to crack down on what's likely accurate, true opposition speech, which is, again, not the same thing as mis or disinformation. So again, you see Russia and the Kremlin spending what seems like more effort in silencing critics of the war than actually addressing the sources of their criticism. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. As always, a huge thank you to our Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. I couldn't do this without you guys, as well as our Lieutenant tier members. Thank you all so much. We're going to be dropping a new video there probably today or tomorrow, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.